music. The story of Carlos Monzón is one of the biggest stories of his life in prison for the murder of the person he claimed to love the most. So a good boxer, yes, but he was a monster too. And this is the tragic, violent story of Carlos Monzón. So let's get straight to it, shall we? What did Monzón do that was so bad? He was one of the three most violent streets of Santa Fe City's Barranquitas Westy neighborhood. He was one of 13 brothers and sisters, and he was forced to leave school to look for work at the age of just 8 because the family was so poor. By the time he was 16, he had already fathered his first child, a son. But that's hardly a crime. He then married at 19. His wife was not his first son's mother. He was one to have 2 natural children, but they also adopted a third child, and many believe Monzón was the child's father, the result of an extramarital affair. Aha! But no, come on. He liked the ladies and slept around a bit. Not exactly upstanding behavior, but it doesn't make him a monster either. But now we're coming to it, because as well as marital infidelity, he had a far more dangerous personality flaw. In the boxing ring, he had a talent for violence, and he was all but unstoppable. The problem was he couldn't switch the violence off once he stepped outside the ropes, and he was notoriously unable to control his temper later in life. He admitted to having beaten every woman he had been with, and this means his unfortunate young wife was likely to have been just as familiar with the power of his punches as the opponents he faced off against inside the squared circle. However, his fame as a boxer continued to grow first in Argentina and then internationally. His fans, especially those back home, adored him, and they continued to turn a blind eye to the less savory aspects of his character. As he rose to the top of the sport, he led an increasingly glamorous jet-setter lifestyle, and many people chose to focus on this, rather than his violence and mistreatment of women. His trainer, Amilcar Brusa, was well aware of these issues and grew accustomed to keeping the worst of it out of the papers to maintain Monzón's reputation as best he could. But then, a story broke that gave Brusa something more challenging to deal with. It was reported that Monzón, by this time already world champion, had been shot in his home. At first, it appeared that the shot had been fired by accident, and Monzón and his wife tried to claim that a bullet had hit Monzón when his gun discharged after being dropped on the floor. His wife was even seen smiling and speaking to the press, saying she had warned Monzón he needed to be more careful when handling his firearms. The problem was Monzón had been shot twice, once in the arm and once in the shoulder. Being shot accidentally by a weapon that's been dropped on the floor once is plausible, but not twice. By this point, though Monzón already enjoyed hero status in Argentina, and the police were happy to go along with his story, or perhaps they had just been paid off. But then the truth came out. Before the shooting, Monzón and his wife had been seen physically fighting in front of their home, and then his wife took the pistol and shot him with it. At first, he refused to go to the hospital. This gives you some idea of what kind of man he was, to shrug off 2 bullet wounds, but eventually, his trainer persuaded him to seek medical help. In the hospital, the bullet in his arm was removed after a 2-hour operation, but the other bullet remained lodged in his shoulder for the rest of his life. But why did his wife shoot him? Predictably, the argument had been about him seeing other women. And think about it. Monzón is the one with all the previous for violence and cheating. So what must he have done this time? To drive his wife to take a gun and fire 2 shots at him? Do you see a pattern emerging here? Next, Monzón began a highly publicized relationship with Susana Jiménez, one of the most famous actresses in Argentina at the time, and still a well-known personality to this day. They had met when he featured alongside her in a movie. He was now so famous and popular in his home country that he was appearing on screen as well as in the ring, and their very public affair took place while he was still married. During their time together, Jiménez was frequently seen wearing sunglasses, and you can guess by now that this probably wasn't always to keep the sun out of her eyes. Monzón was also charged several times with assaulting the paparazzi who followed him around in the hopes of capturing photos of him with his mistresses. On some occasions, he even put some of them in hospital. After breaking up with Jiménez, getting divorced from his wife, and briefly dating Ursula Andrés Monzón, married Uruguayan model Alicia Muñiz, a woman he had been seeing sporadically for some years, and who he described as the love of his life. However, even his professed love wasn't enough to protect her from his violent temper, and he beat her too, just as he had every other woman in his life. In the years after his retirement from boxing, he began to develop an increasingly unhealthy relationship with alcohol, and this is thought to have played a role in what happened next. One day, when he was away with Muñiz after he had been drinking, he flew into a rage, first beating her, then picking her up and throwing her from the balcony of the hotel room where they were staying. He fell with her, but survived with just an injured shoulder. Muñiz, on the other hand, wasn't so lucky. She died from the fall. He claimed that they had fallen together, and that it had been an accident. But the jury disagreed, sentencing him to 11 years in prison. After serving 5.5 years of his sentence, he was let out on furlough for a weekend to visit his family. But then, while driving back to prison, his car was involved in an accident. It flipped over and he was killed instantly at the age of 52, and so ended the turbulent life of the boxer they nicknamed La Escopeta, meaning the shotgun. But what had Muñiz achieved inside the boxing ring that caused his fans to overlook such appalling behavior in his private life? Muñiz had his first amateur bout at 17, and in 3 years he fought 87 times, winning 73, losing 6, and drawing 8. He then turned pro, and of his first 20 fights, he won 16 and lost 3, with one being declared a no contest. However, he quickly put the losses right by beating all 3 opponents in rematches, and after his 20th fight, he was never to lose again for the rest of his career. Unbelievably, he was only given his first shot at the world title. In his 81st professional bout, it came against Italian fighter Nino Benvenuti, who he was set to face in Rome. Despite at that time holding a record of 68-3-9 with one no contest, Muñiz's song was still largely unknown, perhaps because most of his fights had been in Argentina. As a result, he was given little chance against the popular champion, a man who had previously beaten the legendary Emil Griffith twice in 3 fights. However, from the first bell, Muñiz was all over Benvenuti, and Benvenuti struggled to cope with his intensity. Muñiz finally found Benvenuti's chin cleanly in the 12th, with a sickening right sending Benvenuti sprawling to the canvas, where he remained unable to rise. With this win, Muñiz captured the WBA, WBC, and Ring Magazine middleweight belts. He then went on to fight a further 18 times, with 14 of these bouts being title defenses. At one point, he was stripped of his WBC strap, but went on to win it back in his 99th fight. He retired after his next bout fight, number 100, with an astonishing record of 87-3-9, and won no contest with 59 wins coming. By way of knockout, he was only knocked down once in his entire career, and all 3 of his losses as a professional came by decision. His reign as champion was the second longest in middleweight history, and for his feats in the ring, he was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame in 1990. Monzón is now rightly remembered as one of the pound-for-pound all-time greats, but as we've already seen, his legacy outside the ring was much darker. During the height of his fame, Monzón was worshipped as an idol in his homeland, but understandably he was not universally loved. He epitomized macho culture, which many embraced, and his fans were enthralled by his extravagant, decadent lifestyle. But others despised him for his outrageous behavior, and especially for his treatment of women. Due to his fame, the domestic violence and his frequent infidelities were overlooked by his fans, and he even received a statue in his honor in Santa Fe where he grew up. But this statue also highlights what a divisive character he was and still is. For his fans, the statue has become a pilgrimage site, somewhere to go for a selfie in front of their hero. But protesters against domestic violence have vandalized it several times. Once, an unofficial new plaque was even made and placed on the statue reading in Spanish, "World Champion and Woman Killer." As a boxer, he was known for his speed, fearsome power, and aggressive style. Aficionados also noted his ring IQ and his ability to box as well as to brawl. He was described as a complete fighter who had it all, and some even hail him as the greatest middleweight of all time. But he will also always be remembered as one of the most flawed champions the sport has ever known, and for his inability to control the violent tendencies that made him a legend inside the ring, but an awful human being outside of it.